World Spaceflight News Special Report.
What I believe history will record that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17.
10, 9, 8, 7, ignition sequence started. All engines are started. We have ignition. 2, 1, 0. We have a liftoff.
17 Houston, you are go for orbit. Go for orbit.
America, Houston, this is America. You can breathe easier. America has arrived on station for the challenge ahead. Are we coming in? Oh, baby. Okay, Houston, the Challenger has landed. We'd like to dedicate the first steps of Apollo 17 to all those who made it possible. Oh, my golly. Unbelievable. This has got to be one of the most proud moments of my life, I guarantee you. The words are here man completed his first exploration of the moon. December 1972 AD. May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind. When we look back at the Apollo program, I don't think anyone can privately to themselves or publicly say that this truly, indeed, has really been a beginning of man's really first venture out into deep space. And once there's a beginning, there's a continuation. A trip to Mars may not be for 10 years, a decade, it may not be till the end of the century. But I personally have faith that it will happen. And I think that the nature of mankind just press on. That's why I believe Apollo 17, yes, it's the beginning, but the whole Apollo program is really the true beginning of what's to come in the future. Godspeed and God bless you all.
Here in Hutchinson, Kansas, is the Cosmosphere, an incredibly rich museum of space artifacts. And outside, as I entered, is a statue of Gene Cernan leaving those last footsteps on the lunar surface. It's a reminder to each generation that the story of humankind has always been linked to the exploration of the unknown. And there's a plaque there next to Cernan's statue. It's a quote from his speech on their departure. As I take man's last step from the surface, I'd like to say what I believe that history will record. The American challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17.
On December 7th, Apollo 17 lit up the night sky at 12:33 a.m. It was a Thursday in 1972, and 500,000 people had come to Florida to witness this launch. But spectators as far away as Miami reported seeing the Saturn V streak across the sky. Walter Cronkite called it a spectacular sight. It was the first night launch of the Apollo program, one of many firsts the mission would achieve. Aboard the spacecraft were Commander Eugene Cernan, who had flown on Gemini 9A and Apollo 10, Command Module pilot Ronald Evans, an experienced naval aviator and aeronautical engineer, and Lunar Module pilot Dr. Harrison Schmitt, the first scientist to set foot on the moon. And 5 additional crew members. You can see one of them here, mice that the astronauts had nicknamed Fee, Fi, Fo, Fum, and Fooey. And these mice and Evans would go on to share the record of the longest amount of time in lunar orbit and the most lunar orbits traveled. But before Apollo 17 lit up the night sky and before the crew started their journey to the moon, hundreds of thousands of people spent hundreds of thousands of hours ensuring that the last mission to the moon would be a success. And one of those people was food scientist Rita Rapp. You can see her here. As the head of the Apollo Food System team, she ensured the astronauts would not only be nourished during their flight, but also satisfied with their food choices. Rapp joined NASA in the early 1960s, trained as a physiologist. She conducted biomedical experiments, developed the Gemini medical kit, and then eventually took over the Apollo Food System team. Rapp and her team introduced huge improvements to space food, from using a water pistol to heat and rehydrate dry food, to following rigorous nutritional guidelines. But one snack she sent on the mission must not have appealed to the astronauts. Here it is, gingerbread cubes, so perhaps you can see why it wasn't so appealing. But it's a fitting dessert for a December mission. It went untouched, and the crew brought it back to Earth, and it's now housed at the Smithsonian with all the other space food leftovers. Another key contributor to the mission was Frank Pavliks, a Hungarian-born American engineer responsible for developing the lunar roving vehicle. After the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, Pavliks moved to the United States and took a position at the General Motors Research Division. It was there that he was tasked with the challenge of creating a tough electric vehicle that weighed less than 400 pounds. This is roughly the weight of a single astronaut in a spacesuit. On top of that, it had to be foldable and fit into the lunar module's cargo bay, and it had to be delivered within just 17 months. Pavliks and his colleagues met this deadline, creating a vehicle that boosted the astronauts' range and time to conduct science on the mission. So while the Apollo 11 EVA covered roughly the size of a football field, Apollo 17 explored an area roughly the size of Manhattan. In total, the Apollo 17 crew drove to 9 geological sites. They traversed over 21 miles, and they collected over 240 pounds of lunar samples. The lunar rover helped them make these achievements possible. Iona Allen also helped make these achievements possible. She was a talented seamstress at ILC Industries of Dover, Delaware, which had won the contract for Apollo spacesuits. She gained a reputation as being able to take on the toughest sewing challenges, including the lunar overshoes or boots. Gene Cernan's overshoes are shown here with traces of lunar regolith picked up from 3 long EVAs. After taking the last steps on the moon, he had the foresight to bring them back to Earth, and you can see them now at the National Air and Space Museum. Preparing for Apollo 17 required extensive training, from countless hours in mission simulators to practicing sampling in pressure suits at the Kennedy Space Center rock pile, you can see here, and geology field trips to places like Nevada. It also involved learning about orbital lunar geology from Farouk Elbaz, an Egyptian-American based at Belcom. Elbaz trained Ron Evans on how to look for color changes on the surface of the moon, since human eyes are more sensitive to subtle color variations than photographs taken from orbit. Elbaz also analyzed thousands of lunar photographs to select ideal landing sites. for the Apollo missions, sites that would be both geologically rich and also safe for landings. For Apollo 17, geologists thought the Taurus littoral offered the right combination of rock slides with samples older than those that had been collected on previous missions, and volcanic cinder cones that might contain younger material than what had been collected on previous missions. So on December 11th, Cernan and Schmitt conducted their first moonwalk. They deployed the lunar rover, they raised an American flag, they set up a series of scientific experiments, and they collected samples from Steno crater. On the second moonwalk, they fixed their rover fender with an ingenious solution devised by Mission Control. They visited the Nansen crater, and then they took a core sample from the Ballet crater, which is pictured here. This year, NASA opened the vacuum-sealed core sample for the very first time. 50 years ago, they recognized that tools and techniques would mature, and in turn, we would have new ways of studying this material today. Near the end of the third and final EVA, Cernan and Schmitt spoke to 70 international students who had been invited to the Johnson Space Center. They described a rock they collected, pieces of which would be given to nations worldwide. Cernan explained, "We hope that this will be a symbol of what our feelings are, what the feelings of the Apollo program are, and a symbol of mankind, that we can live in peace and harmony in the future." This sample became known as the Children of the World rock, and small fragments of it were given to countries throughout the world in 1973. This perspective that Cernan articulated was amplified by another gift brought back from the mission: the blue marble photograph. Although the ATS-3 satellite had captured an image of the whole Earth years before, it was this photograph taken by a human hand with this Hasselblad camera in the photo here that resonated so deeply that it became one of the most reproduced images in history. As Cernan explained, this image should be seen, quote, from a philosophical point of view. "This is us," he said. "We're looking at ourselves." The Apollo 17 crew collected invaluable lunar samples and data that have advanced our understanding of the moon and our solar system. But they also gave us a self-portrait with this blue marble image, one that offered us a perspective on Earth and ourselves.
Hey, I'm Dr. Brian Odom. I'm the NASA Chief Historian. It's a thrill to be in here in front of you guys today. But as you know, Harrison Schmitt, unfortunately, not me, but Harrison Schmitt, was supposed to be here today. But due to a conflict of schedules, he was unable to do that. But he did have a chance to reach out to his NASA friends and share some messages about the importance of the mission, the importance of lunar science, and what we might expect in the future.
No matter how much preparation you have for experiences like stepping on the moon, it's going to be more than you ever anticipated.
Schmitt was the first trained field geologist to observe the moon up close and personal, and he found himself discovering unexpected things with every step.
Every rock that we examined had something new that I didn't expect, and surprises is what geologists like. That's why you're exploring, is to see the things that nobody's ever seen before.
Schmitt spent a combined 22 hours outside of the spacecraft during his 3 excursions on the moon. Before his own trip, Schmitt trained other Apollo astronauts, sharing with them his in-depth knowledge of fieldwork.
The main thing was to expose them to as many different, say, geological experiences as we possibly could. Get them out in the field. Don't let them sit in the classroom.
He treated training scenarios on Earth the same way he would if they were on the moon, including simulated equipment, backpacks, and cameras strapped to the front of spacesuits. Astronauts could then focus on what differences in the rocks they were seeing and what rock samples were best to collect, essentially giving them the fundamental field geological experiences that they needed to succeed. The 4 or 5 days per month Schmitt spent training astronauts in the field really did make a difference.
The quality and diversity of the Apollo sample collection, independent of Apollo 17, where you had an experienced geologist, the quality and diversity of that sample collection is just remarkable.
Fortunately, the current Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission, or LRO, is changing the game, bringing back high-quality photography of the moon that Schmitt only wished he'd seen before his own trip.
The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter program now has provided us with a much, much higher resolution suite of photographs for any future astronauts.
What we learned from the Apollo missions helped lay the groundwork for LRO, and LRL will help guide future explorers.
Every new environment in which a geologist works is usually very different than the last, but you have learned things from your previous experiences that do in fact enable you to maximize the value of your new experience.
Schmitt has his fingers crossed for future moon exploration, a landscape he considers holds answers to many questions about the early solar system.
You can hear people talk about it, but you can't absorb it until you're there.
I think as this program shows, and as Harrison Jack, as I will call him, those who are close to him, just told us there's a lot left to do. And that is nowhere more true than in science. One of the things that I loved about those videos we watched, you can really hear the enthusiasm in the scientist's voice and the astronaut's voice as they're talking about seeing things for the first time. The thrill of it, what they're experiencing. One of the things that was interesting about being a part of the cadre of astronauts that built the International Space Station was that as we added each element, we also added new camera views. And every time we added something to the space station on an assembly mission, we had our minds blown. We saw the station from a different point of view. We saw the shuttle from a different point of view. We saw the Earth from a different point of view. And each step really gave us a new lens to look at what we were doing through. You can really see some of that enthusiasm and that amazing sense of having a different lens from the most recent Artemis 1 mission. The pictures that we recovered from the moon, we've taken pictures of the moon before, but how long has it been since we saw live from the moon? And the views involved the Orion spacecraft. That was a view we've never seen before. It was just incredibly moving and inspiring to feel that we have this new lens to look through and how much we're going to learn about the moon as we go on this trip. For me, the Apollo missions were personally very inspiring. The Apollo missions were what inspired me to decide to become a scientist and an astronaut. Yes, it's actually true. I am a test pilot, but my undergraduate degree was in physics and astronomy, and I have a master's degree in planetary science. It's been a long time since I'd done it. But I was very, very inspired by the idea of visiting other planets and exploring them. In many ways, Jack was my hero. On Apollo 17, we saw the groundbreaking science that could happen when you sent a trained scientist to the surface of the moon. Now, I happen to be married to a professional geologist, so I know the limitations of how far I can go as a test pilot. I love science and I'm passionate about it, but there is nothing like the eyes of a trained scientist. And in many ways, that kicked the door down when you look at what we did on the space shuttle, to the diversity of backgrounds and experiences, bringing professional scientists and not just test pilots as astronauts. I think it transformed everything that we have done since, and Jack was the first to do that. He not only helped the science outcomes on the Apollo program by training his fellow astronauts, and of course on Apollo 17, but he actually was deeply involved in forging lunar science after his mission, and was very, very engaged in the community. That lunar science is paying enormous dividends for us today as we prepare to go back to the moon. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was mentioned in the video, and that continues to be our eye in the sky. We need to start thinking about even higher resolution pictures. I'm looking forward to that. I think that's going to be important to exploration. And of course, Capstone, our first CubeSat to orbit the moon. It's charting a very unique orbit. One of the interesting things about the science that we're going to learn on Artemis is that it is not just about planetary science, although I'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the things that I think is particularly exciting is the capabilities in other disciplines, such as astrophysics and heliophysics, that we can do from the moon. The science accomplishments of Apollo 17 specifically are many. We continue to learn from all the Apollo samples. I was delighted that we opened the Apollo 17, the last sample, because it means we have to go back and get more. That's good. This mission was particularly noteworthy, though, thanks especially to Jack Schmitt. A 4.2 billion year old sample. Incredible. That is just, I mean, it's almost impossible to fathom because, of course, it's the history also of the Earth, the Moon and the Earth system. Evidence of the Moon's volcanism. That was a big shocker. There were a lot of experiments that focused on some subtle areas that I think we have much more to explore, particularly soil mechanics, seismic profiling, and of course orbital science, as I mentioned. Science is really one of the main reasons we're going back to the moon. It's foundational to why we go to space, is to get a unique perspective, science that can only be done from space and from exploration. James Webb, of course, being a classic example. We can only see in those frequencies in that particular manner, deep back into the history of the the cosmos, by being in space. But in addition to that, we cannot learn about our solar system and about the Earth-Moon system and the environment around it without visiting. But there's a lot more to do. So when the first woman and the next man set foot on lunar soil, they're going to have a wealth of much more sophisticated tools at hand. So we will try to pre-deliver technology that will amplify and enhance the science mission. And we're going to have other payloads that are going to help them become scientists in residence.